So, when I was on a trip and I was able to dip into northern Finland, I collected the bones of this next story from a Sami culture camp. I'd like for you to imagine that it's about 1900. It is the middle of December, and we are in northern Finland, and the sun has not been visible for some weeks. The old Sami woman stood in front of her wood stove. She had a chunk of wood and she was about to feed that to the fire. And this Sami woman, she was never tall to begin with, but with age, she had become quite bent. So now she was just downright tiny, but yet she was substantial, like a gnarled stump. And she jammed that chunk of wood in the wood stove and closed the stove door. And then she sat down in her chair and picked up her mug of hot tea. Well, not far from her, in another chair, there was the minister who had come for yet another visit. And he too was holding his mug of hot tea. And he said, "Your fire burns bright, and it warms your cabin admirably." And the Sami woman said, "When you live in cold, dark places, you must worship warm gods." Now, this made the minister bristle a little bit, but he was used to this coming from her. She was proving to be a tough nut to crack. So he said to her, "Do you realize that you are the only person in the whole region who still clings to the old beliefs?" And the old woman said, "I am content." So the minister decided to change the subject, and he said, I've been reading some things scientific, and there is a growing belief that the northern lights are in some way connected to activity from the sun. That just seems so far-fetched to me." And the old woman said, "Oh, but the sun is a very powerful god." And the minister thought, "Oh, I walked into that." So he decided to change the subject again. And he said, "There are some in the village that think that wolves are around. The reindeer are very restless." And the old woman was quiet for a moment. And then she said, "It could be wolves, or it could be Christmas travelers." And the minister perked up at this, and he said, "Christmas travelers? Do you mean like the three kings of the Orient who made their way to Bethlehem?" "No. No, the Christmas travelers are spirits. Spirits that walk here in the Northland in these dark times, a time that you call Christmas. Perhaps they are spirits of those that were lost in the wilds, or maybe they have no family. There are some that think that perhaps they are seeking to draw others into their fold." The minister said, "Well, how do you know of these spirits? Have you seen them?" "No, no. It is only rare that they can be seen by a human, but reindeers see them, as do dogs and cats, and it makes them restless." And then the minister said, "Well, if you've never seen them, then how do you know they exist?" And the old woman said, "Well, that's an interesting question coming from someone of the likes of you. But do you know Jarvis in the valley over?" "Do you mean the blind man?" "Yes. He was not always blind. When Jarvis was a young boy, one December night, he was with his family in their cabin. And they could hear in the pen next to the cabin that the reindeer, they were stomping their hooves and they were snorting. Something was disturbing them. And so they sent Jarvis out to investigate. Now, there was no sun, but the moon was shining brightly and it reflected on the snow, so it was actually quite bright. And Jarvis, he walked all around that corral that was holding those reindeer, and he saw no tracks of wolves. He heard no howls. But it was then that he saw the procession. It was a procession of sleighs, and the first sleigh, that was pulled by a coal-black steed. And in that sleigh, there were two people. They were very pale. And even though they passed right by the boy, they never looked at him. And the second sleigh, that was pulled by a cow. And in that sleigh, there was one man. He had only one eye. He too was very pale. He never looked at the boy. And the third sleigh was pulled by a white reindeer, and so on and so forth. The whole series of sleighs, each one pulled by a different animal, until the final sleigh was pulled by a tiny mouse. And even though this mouse was just so small, it did not strain at all to pull this sleigh and its pale occupants, who did not look at the boy. And at the end of the procession, there was a man walking, and this man was wearing skins, reindeer skins, that were very light in color, and they reflected the moon. He just seemed to glow. And Jarvis was so taken by this that he couldn't help but call out, "Good day, sir!" And it was only then that the man turned and looked at the boy, and his eyes got wide, and the look of fear came across his face, as though he had never expected to be seen by a human. And so he began to say, "No, no, 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 mark my words, nothing good will come of this." And it was that night that Jarvis became very ill. He had a high fever that raged for days. But when he recovered and he opened his eyes, that's when they learned that he was sightless. "So that's why I know there are Christmas travelers," said the old woman. The minister stirred uncomfortably and said, "You seem to fear the winter darkness." "Oh, the winter season is nothing to take lightly." And the two sat quietly in their chairs, thinking their own thoughts for a long time, until the fire had burned down and it was time for another piece of wood. So the old woman got up, and as she was getting the wood, that was when the minister said to her, tell me, when the sun, your God, disappears for weeks on end in the winter months, how does that make you feel? Does that make you feel abandoned by your God?" And the old woman was managing this chunk of wood, and she said, no. Before the God disappears, she sends one of her children to my cabin, and it sits right here on the stove and keeps me warm all winter. And the minister looked at the stove as though he were expecting to see a little God sitting right there. But instead, what he saw was the Sami woman, and she was holding that chunk of wood. And so the minister said, So you believe in the sun god, and you believe that everything has a spirit, and you believe that trees are gods, but yet you cut down trees and you burn them. And the old Sami woman, she stuffed that chunk of wood in the stove and then closed the stove door. And then she turned and looked at the minister. She pulled herself up to her full height, which wasn't much, but it was enough. And she looked the minister in the eye and said, "Only a God is worthy food for another God." And the two looked at one another for a time, and in their glance, back and forth, there was respect and also a fondness. And then the two began to gently laugh.